Oh, hi, Tony.
Hi.
How are you?
Nice to see you again. Yeah, fine.
Yeah,
Thanks.
nice to see
Chinar,
you.
recording.
Yes, so Vijay Lakshmi, can you please start recording?
Yeah, done.
We're live on Facebook and YouTube.
Yeah. Shall I go ahead?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So we have the next plenary session 9, and second plenary of the day. And we have Professor Tony C from Singapore, who is delivering his plenary lecture there. And it will be chaired by Professor Saima Said, who is a Honorary Director, Center for Culture, Media and Governance, Jamia Millia Islamia. I will just give a very brief introduction to Professor Simon Said. He's a Honorary Director and Professor at the Center for Culture, Media and Governance, Jamia Millia Islamia in New Delhi. She has a very diverse work experience spanning across the media industry, media teaching and research. And she was an alumnus of AJK Mass Communication Research Center, Jamia. And she completed her doctoral studies from the Department of Social Work, Jamia Millia Islamia, on the role of television in ushering in and catalyzing and sustaining social development. Dr. Said joined the Center for Culture, Media and Governance as Culture, Media and Governance as part of its founding team and has been associated with ever since. And she's now the Honorary Director of the Center, and she has written a book based on her PhD thesis and titled Screening the Public Sphere, Media and Democracy in India, published by Routledge. And she's a noted Habermasian communication scholar. And over to you, Saima.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Manoj, for this very generous introduction. What a pleasure. And it's been an extremely exciting conference. As usual, the way Dr. Manoj is able to always, have these conferences. So life and finite immanence, inflection and indeterminacy. And we are on day 3, the plenary session. And we have with us Professor Tony C. Meeting Professor Tony C. after a long time, just before the pandemic sort of burst open, I think, and here we are. So to introduce the speaker for the session, Tony C. is currently Associate Lecturer teaching Political Philosophy and International Relations for the University of London, programs in the Singapore Institute of Management, Global Education in Singapore. His research interests include comparative philosophy, critical theory, and media studies. His current research interest is in exploring theories of subjectivity with a focus on the intersections between Deleuze's idea of immanence and desire and its resonances with the idea of Buddhism, Buddha nature of Mahayana's Buddhism. His previous publications include the book Community Without Identity, The Ontology and Politics of Heidegger in 2009, and a number of articles and research papers such as Deleuze and the Mahayana Buddhism in 2014, Deleuze and Ikada, and Deleuze, Religion and Education in 2016. So a very warm welcome to you, Tony, this morning. And I don't want to stay between the speaker and the audience. So may I now please invite you to kindly deliver your talk. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Saima, for your generous introduction. And thank you, Manoj, for your hard work. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay. So the title of my talk will be What is Planetary Thinking? Heidegger and Deleuze. So I will begin by referring to the world of Indian philosophy, specifically Indian mythology. So in the world of Indian mythology, there is the story of Indra's net. And Indra is the king of the Vedic deities in Indian mythology. The figure of Indra can be found in an Indian Buddhist text called Avantamsaka Sutra, where it is described that Indra's palace on Mount Meru, a gigantic mountain that sits at the center of the earth, which can be regarded as the axis mundi of the world in Vedic cosmology. There is a net that stretches infinitely in all directions. In this sutra, there's a reference to this particular kind of net in which there's a note in each of the net where the heavenly strands intersect, and there hangs a jewel. As the net stretches across the infinite breadth of the universe, the jewels are also infinite in number. As all the strands of the net are connected in some ways with each other, when one is affected, the whole is affected. In this story of Indra's net, nothing is disconnected from something else, and everything is connected in some ways with some other things, even if the connections are unseen, subterranean, and invisible. The question of whether this net exists is beside the point. What this literary image is trying to tell us is something I feel very important. I believe that there are two ideas that we can draw from this. Firstly, Indra's net in the Avatamsaka Sutra tells us that all phenomena arise in an interdependent way, that no phenomena has an independent existence, or expressed in a positive way, that all phenomena exist in dependence on each other. When one is affected, all others are affected. Secondly, the story of Indra's net also illustrates the idea of the interpenetration of all phenomena, that all phenomena are not simply connected to each other in some ways, but they also interpenetrate with each other. In the story of Indra's net, the jewels that hang from the filaments are not only physically tied to each other, the jewels also have a mirror-like quality, and so the jewels mirror each other. Each facet of the jewel reflects all other jewels that hangs from the net. The jewels are brilliant and stunning, but they can also reflect every other jewel. In a word, every jewel is in reality a reflection of all other jewels, and every jewel in some ways owes its brilliance or its darkness and in fact its very existence to a network of reflections to which it contributes. In the context of Indian Buddhism, this refers to a condition in which there is no real barriers, no real boundaries, no real territories between all phenomena. Any boundaries that we see are temporary, constructed, and even apparent without any ultimate reality. In short, the story of Indra's net in Mahayana Buddhism presents to us a planetary image of the interdependence of all things, the interpenetration of all things, the oneness of all life forms on Earth. Now, this interdependence of various entities become clear during this pandemic. In the early days of the pandemic, we see various governments responding by closing borders and imposing surveillance and control of the population. These measures, in the words of the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, smacks of biopolitics and can only lead to the erosion of liberal democratic institutions. These measures only show that power still exists in the hands of the state, but they do not show that the states can effectively deal with the pandemic. To be sure, this does not mean that there were no successful state measures, rather that we are looking at the effectiveness of borders and territories, which turn out to be not very effective. The reliance on closing borders and territories has been shown to be not very effective in keeping out the virus. And even when it does stopping the virus in one state present a success in preventing its spread and mutation outside the state. What has other states got to do with my state, the state that I happen to be in? Aren't they over there and I'm over here, separated by a border? Well, as long as other states have not recovered, the possibility of reinfection and mutation remains a real possibility and in fact an actuality. Unless the state wants to remain closed indefinitely, it shows that the solution offered by the state are so far short-sighted. So we only have short-term solutions, but no long-term solutions in an age of planetary crisis. Max Weber has, in his lecture, Politics as a Vocation, defined the state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Along with this conception of state, Barry Buzan, in his study, People, States, and Fear, has raised interesting and important questions about whether states, given the nature of the international system, are capable of thinking in a more cooperative terms. In addition to this question, whether national security and international security considerations are in fact compatible. I argue that while the concept of the state has served its purpose in the past, there is a need to rethink the concept of the state in the face of present problems. In Deleuze and Guattari's theory of the state, we are told that the state is not a concrete entity, but rather an abstract machine that rules through minute institutions and practices of domination, and yet the state stands above them. In his words, the state is that which overcoats and regulates these minor dominations, stamping them with an imprint. What is important about this abstract machine is not the particular form in which it appears, but rather its function, which refers to the constitution of a field of interiority in which political sovereignty can be exercised. The state, after all, is a process of capture. This is ultimately meant as a means of getting organized as an antagonistic manner. That is, there is a necessity for states to exist, for territories to be established as a way of obtaining security in the world. But has the state become obsolete in the age of COVID-19? This is the question that we need to think at this moment in time. The resurgence of nationalism in recent years suggests that national and international security are quite becoming incompatible. This is even more obvious during the pandemic when states close their borders, thinking that they can focus on the internal security with less regard for the security of their neighbors. They are forced to open only when essential supplies are needed from other countries. In other words, for economics and trade. In other words, states enter a kind of a security dilemma, and I would like to call them sort of like a conflicted and have some kind of a split personality, in which they have to be close to be secure and yet to be open where trade and economic security is to be secured. So the idea that the state has become obsolete in dealing with global crisis finds resonance in Heidegger's thinking. In 1966, he gave a very special interview in Der Spiegel, in which he stated in the clearest possible terms the nature of his philosophical investigation. He states, and I quote, "During the past 60 years, 30 years, it should be meanwhile have become clearer that planetary movement of modern technology is a power whose great role in determining history can hardly be overestimated. A decisive question for me today is how a political system can be assigned to today's technological age at all, and which political system would that be? I have no answer to this question, but I am not convinced that it is democracy." While this passage may give the impression that Heidegger was anti-democratic, it actually expresses a pessimism with regards to existing democratic institutions, or for that matter, any political institutions, whether they are able to deal with the rise of planetary technology, planetary problems, and planetary issues. And the latest COVID-19 pandemic is just one example. So this turns out to be an expansion of the Heideggerian motif that Western political state form is an expression of humanism, a metaphysics that obscures being, that is found throughout his writings. This is why, from this perspective, it does not matter whether we are referring to American capitalism or Russian, and for that matter now, Chinese communism. It makes no difference whether they are left or right, because they are both manifestation of the metaphysics of domination of the human subject. He states, every nationalism is metaphysically and anthropologicalism, and as such, a form of subjectivism. Nationalism is not overcome through mere internationalism. It is rather expanded and elevated thereby into a system. Nationalism is as little brought and raised to humanitas by internationalism as individualism is by an ahistorical collectivism. This appearance of the subject is brought about, according to Heidegger, in much of his writings, when the world has metaphysically become a world picture, what he called a Weltbild. The appearance of the subject and the reduction of the world into a world picture are basically the same event. In advancing the idea of the planetary, Heidegger referred to in The Question of Being, 1958. He writes, "We are obliged not to give up the effort of planetary thinking." Heidegger's recommendation is that we must not avoid facing the need for planetary thinking because there's no other way but to go forward, right? So the later Heidegger would recommend letting be a Gelassenheit, a frame of mind in relation to planetary technology. The word Gelassenheit was borrowed from Meister Eckhart, a 13th century German Catholic mystic and theologian, and it suggests of an attitude or comportment of attentive care towards technology, not to abuse technology, nor to be abused by technology. And in this comportment, there is no sense of trying to overcome technology, as Heidegger would later realize, for this merely reinforces the metaphysics of technological domination. Heidegger's warning is timely, for he stands at the edge of new developments in atomic and nuclear weapons, but also just before the rise of the internet. However, there are a number of questions, even if we are to accept Heidegger's recommendation of Gelassenheit. The German translation normally is letting be, and sometimes it's translated as letting be free. And to let be free is to care, right? Is to show Sorge for other beings. So but there are some issues with his recommendation as to how we may approach this planetary new age. So the first concerns Heidegger's analysis of the problem, which seems to be founded on his analysis of Greek experience. If we accept that the Greeks have influenced the development of our thinking, it remains contingent, and according to Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy, it is not necessary. Janae Schultz have already stated this in her book on Heidegger and Deleuze. For Deleuze, it is not that the conjunction of the Greek territory and Western Earth is wrong, but that to continue to return to this origin is reductive. In other words, there's a sense in which the idea of the planetary is derived from or reliance on the Greek experience, and to the exclusion of other experience. For example, Indian experience, Chinese experience, Arabic experience. So these are some issues. It doesn't mean that he's wrong, but this is just a perennial question between Deleuzian and Heideggerian scholars, whether the reference to the Greek experience offers us a legitimate starting point from which to analyze and critique Western culture. Secondly, the problem with the question with Heidegger's recommendation is that assuming we are indeed in an age of planetary technology dominated by social media technologies, weapons of mass destruction, AI, surveillance technologies, and now micro vaccines. And suppose we need to recognize the need to step back and to engage in Gelassenheit. How are we to step back when design today is fundamentally already submerged in the midst of media and surveillance control? In the words of Foucault, subjectivity offers a kind of resistance to power, but subjectivity itself is already shot through entirely, using the ideas and values of the culture. So how can that which is within the system critique the system without any reference to anything outside the system? So this is a question that I throw, and in order to update Heidegger for the current age of planetary climate crisis and planetary pandemic. Now, from Deleuze's perspective, if we might find an alternative, we find an answer in the idea of the war machine. In Deleuze's analysis, with the traditional view, he disagrees with the traditional view that military institutions are used to augment state power. Instead, borrowing from the ethnological research of Pierre Clestris, Deleuze argues that nomadic societies featured war machine in order to resist state power. To be sure, this does not mean that nomads use warfare against actually existing states. It only means that they use war as a means to resist the emergence of state apparatus. And here we can apply it to the possibility of using war machines against planetary technological domination. In 1,000 Plateaus, it is said that war prevented the centralization of society by maintaining the dispersal of nomadic groups. What interested Deleuze was that war machines imposed various forms of movement that is based on becoming and of the possibility of the event. It means that war opens up the possibility for change, for real change. It is the commitment to this ethos among nomads that prevented the centralization of societies. This kind of war does not aim at battle itself, nor the glorification of battles, nor the elimination of the state, or the fulfillment of some rationally defined political end. This kind of war aims at warding off the processes of state formation and the attendant stratification of thought, movement, and disposition. These types of nomadic war are different from state wars. They are invented by the nomads themselves. Thus, Deleuze and Guattari argues that war is not part of the state apparatus, but something which can be extracted, or rather, something that can be divorced or split from the state apparatus. While the war machine is associated with the nomads, the military institutions, on the other hand, are identified with the state. So the war machine is not military institutions of the state. The war machine is of another species, of another nature, of another origin to that of the state. Although the two have different origins, there is some relation between the two. According to Deleuze, the sovereign power of the state is based on appropriating the war machine for its own ends. Deleuze refers to the theory of Georges Dumézil to support his argument. Dumézil's theory is useful for two reasons. The first reason is that Dumézil effectively shows that the attempt to strategize a relation between the state and war is a move that is found repeatedly in the mythological representations of sovereignty that can be dated back to the earliest records of Indo-European civilization. The second reason that Dumézil is useful is that he's able to demonstrate that in spite of this attempt by the state to strategize a relation between itself and the war machine for domination, the war machine remains in a milieu of exteriority that is located outside of the state machine. As such, the war machine is always possesses the metamorphic power of change, which Deleuze argues accrues to authority and difference. Dumézil's work demonstrates that early Indo-European societies have a hierarchical, ordered, tripartite forms of social organization that involves a priestly stratum, a warrior stratum, and a further cultivator stratum. Dumézil also, based on ancient Sanskrit religious literature, such as the Rig Veda, shows us that there are three stratas of God which can be found in almost every culture, and that they are hierarchically ranked, and that they are differentiated in function. This is a feature that is also found in a later Indian text, such as the Vedas, the Brahmanas, and the Mahabharata. What happens usually is that at the top of this strata, there is always the sovereign gods, Mitra and Varuna. These gods have a specific division of labor with regard to the concept of sovereignty. While Mitra relates to the rational and legal aspects of sovereignty, Varuna represents the magical, religious, spiritual, even irrational aspects of sovereignty, or supranatural, emotional aspects of sovereignty. Deleuze argues that Dumézil's thesis is important because it shows that there was neither war nor warrior god located in this highest strata. The warlike gods only exist at the second divine level, one that is dominated by Indra. So we come back one full circle in my presentation to Indra. But this time the Indra is in Hindu mythology, not in Buddhist cosmology. So the warlike gods only exist at the second divine level, one that is dominated by Indra, the representation of the god of war. Indra organizes armies and conducts war in contrast to Mitra and Varuna. This god, Indra, is an essential component of political sovereignty, but yet lies outside this sovereignty because he is not he does not belong to the first level of gods. Dumézil's research shows that for both Indian and Roman accounts, there is actually a deeply rooted opposition between gods of sovereignty and gods of war. And perhaps by reading how states have become problematic in the face of planetary challenges, this distinction between sovereignty, gods of sovereignty and gods of war might help us to reconceptualize a strategy for resisting domination and moving forward. So Indra usually is outside the control of the first level of gods as he commits acts that precisely violates laws created by the sovereign gods. The gods of war shows break, resistance, and challenge the established law. In fact, because of their being outside the established law, it demands the constant vigilance of the gods of the highest levels in order to sort of engage in surveillance and control and of him. So Dumézil's research shows that the integration of war within the political sovereignty necessarily leads to oppositions and conflict within the system itself. Dumézil's research supports Deleuze's argument that war is irreducible to sovereignty and prior to its law. The central idea is that no matter how much the state tries to integrate war within its domain, what Agamben might call biopolitics, there is always something irreducible in the military institutions, specifically the war machines that may be hiding in the military institutions or any other institutions that can be potentially directed against the sovereign form. And in conclusion, there is a need to recognize the limitations of state thinking today, because this need has become all the more obvious in the light of global planetary climate crisis, and currently we are in this coronavirus pandemic, and so far all the measures by the state and the international seem to work sometimes and sometimes doesn't work, and it seems like movement control sometimes work and sometimes doesn't. But we are not going to examine all of these moves by the state. The central idea behind what we want to say today is that the state, because it is still it still relies on the concept of territory, right, on a physical territory, and it sees security in terms of this territory. It sort of doesn't bother about what other states are doing. Well, in primitive societies and in Deleuze's account, primitive and despotic society, you might be able to do it. Let's say that there's a volcano, there's a flood. So you organize the community or the state, you organize a collective to solve human problems. But now the state as an abstraction that solves that solves your ethnic or maybe historical group problems has become an obstacle itself in solving a planetary problem, because the problem we face now is not just a flood, it's not just a volcano, but problems of climate change and now global pandemic. So to continue to think I think in Thousand Plateaus they refer to this as a state form of thinking, to continue to think in terms of state. I think in modern, if you think of it in modern political science, you can call it a kind of nationalism. So nationalism has its necessity and its usefulness, right? When other groups threaten your security. But now nationalism seems not to work in the face of this global pandemic, right? Not just physical barriers, but technological barriers. I think when some countries do not share their technologies openly or do not take into consideration all citizens of the world, right? I mean, it sounds a bit utopian, but it seems this is the way. If any country is not, cured, if I think it means that the potential for mutation is still there. So if anyone is not, if any one node, to go back to Indra's net, if any one node is not secure, then all nodes are in fact not secure. So I think if there's anything good, what little good there is in this pandemic, it is that it forces upon us it brings about a crisis that forces us to rethink our concept of human belonging, whether it's a caste system or a group system or a company, but I think now the major breakthrough that we need to think is in terms of breaking through the limitations of this kind of state thinking, to think of all people as my people. And but of course this sounds a bit anarchist in some sense, but I'm not recommending anarchy in some sense. So what I'm seeing is that there's a task for thinking. So there's a new war machine that is needed today, because in the age of the domination of planetary technology, what we need is in fact a new abstraction which goes beyond the state and beyond globalization, because globalization is just the expansion of capitalism. So what we need is in fact a new planetary war machine. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tony, for this
welcome.
absolutely brilliant and illuminating talk. There's a lot to think about, and I already see there are questions in the chat box. Would you want me to read them, or can you see the chat window?
I can read them.
Okay.
The first one.
So there's a question by Roshni. The first question.
Yeah. Yes, I think Roshni's question is whether Deleuzian reference to Greek origins is similar to Heidegger. It's kind of different because Deleuze would say that Heidegger got the wrong people. So Heidegger was good in tracing Western civilization to the Greeks. But in What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari said that the Greeks themselves were not an originary, they were not one people, they were themselves migrants, and there were a multiplicity of people, which sort of Heidegger ignored. Heidegger sort of assumed that the Greeks were one people. right? So I think in What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari talk about the land, the stratas and migrations and things like that. So the Greeks were themselves a collection of people. So it's kind of different between Heideggerian and Deleuze and Guattari. But there are similarities and differences between them in a sense that we have to have engaged in a genealogy of our thoughts. So our thoughts do not come from nowhere, and there's a necessity to trace where they come from. I think Geoff has a question. So he says, what's the difference between planetary thought and planetary philosophy, and is planetary philosophy possible? I think if there's anything about Deleuze and Guattari, there is that's a very good question. I think what Deleuze and Guattari calls thinking, right, is always to draw a sector or to draw to outline, right, a plane, right, in chaos itself, right? So and this chaos itself gives us it prevents our ossification of our ideas, right? And at the same time, it opens up the possibility of creativity. So we are to stay near this membrane, this thin membrane between chaos and thinking, right? And thinking, of course, can be done in terms of art and music and literature. So is it possible? I would say that currently it is impossible, right? But it is precisely because it is impossible that we have to think it. So I think this is what Deleuze, from my reading of Deleuze and Guattari. So Deleuze and Guattari is not asking us to absorb a ready-made kind of metaphysics kind of thing, but to constantly shift and to create new concepts in order to be able to solve the problems of our time. And bearing this in mind, there is always a need to critique existing concepts, because concepts, but not in an absolute way, because concepts always have some relevance to the time. So even left and right could be concepts that prevent us from bringing about real change sometimes. So we need to see the context and to, so it sort of have to cut, so sort of that, like, you need a diagonal kind of approach rather than us against them kind of thing, which is kind of a delusion thing. To do anything otherwise is, if you're a Marxist, then it's always us against them kind of thing, which works sometimes, but which doesn't work in other times. And yeah, so what's the difference between planetary thought and planetary philosophy? I think Deleuze Deleuze and Heidegger have some similarity in that they make a difference between philosophy and thinking. So I think when the later Heidegger said that we need to abandon philosophy in order to allow thinking to happen, he was talking about philosophy in a context of academia, where academia has fixed approaches, methodologies, and I think just now, Saima mentioned paperwork and all the bureaucracy and all the things. So we should think of bureaucracy as something that supports thinking and not thinking that supports bureaucracy. So at times when this bureaucracy do not work, we need to really rethink and we need to go beyond them, because times have changed. And if your thinking don't change, then you'll be stuck behind. So I think both Deleuze and Guattari and Heidegger, actually, a lot of people think Heidegger is philosophy and then Deleuze is thinking. I think those are from incomplete readings of Heidegger or Deleuze and Guattari. So I would say that for the layman, I think philosophy would be enough, but so long as you understand philosophy in a sense of thinking. Now, what is thinking? Thinking is always opening up to the event, right? To test the concepts and to remain open to what comes in. Okay, I think given the shortness of time, so I think I'll just stop there. And then I think that we have a third question. I think it's from Sibyl. Yeah. Dumizil did not stop with Mitra. Yeah. Varuna, he extends it to Daksha, Aryaman, and Amsa, Bagai, which speaks about becoming multiplicities. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay, thanks. I think that was a feedback. Yes. So due to the time, so I had to restrict to the main point. So I took out a lot of his long description of the primitive state, despotic states, and the Oedipal machinery and anti-production. So all that is like sort of will not help in this talk of understanding the overall movement of my paper. So I think there's another by Hambi, another comment. Thank you for the insightful lecture. DNG's territory seems to be very political or historical concept relating to the war machine, and how does it differ from Heidegger's territory? Now, Heidegger, when Heidegger was talking about territory, it is in this book called Heidegger's Roots, where he talked about how the Greek experience, right, was sort of perverted by the Roman experience, because the Romans territory is the word territory has a Roman origin, right? Something like territoria or something like that. Whereas the Greek have some kind of a I can't remember the exact word, but the Greeks have some kind of a different type of another word for earth, right? So so in Heidegger's philosophy, territory is something that we need to move away from, because territory also gives us time, whereas the Greek earth experience gives us temporalitet, which is so it's very difficult to experience, to explain. So there's two kinds of thought. But in Deleuze and Guattari territory, I think in a recent plenary session, I think Ian Buchanan has already given a very good, thorough coverage of that territory. So territory is sort of like what I call drawing a sector out of chaos, right? So it's a kind of, we constantly territorialize and re-territorialize in order to feel secure, right? So we territorialize in order to get security. So for me, the state is a kind of territorialization of the earth, right? And then it has its users, right? But in the present pandemic and climate crisis, how is I haven't put in all the relevant information in, but you know, in some cases, climate crisis is a planetary global event. But what I read in the news is that many states are unable to work together because they belong to different countries. They say this is not my problem, so my matter spill over to your country, but now we have territorial water, and then we have all this bureaucracy, right? And then so it's your problem, it's not my problem, and then etc. etc. So I think it's everybody's problem, right? So the state machinery worked before the age of planetary crisis, but I think now is sort of the stumbling block for humanity to move forward. As to whether we can arrive at this planetary thinking, currently I'm kind of a little bit pessimistic, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about it, right? And pessimistic because I don't see states as wanting to go beyond the state. I mean, would the statesman want to go beyond the states, right? And I think it's kind of unlikely, right? And yeah, so I'm kind of pessimistic about that. But I think still, if you gather from Heidegger's and Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, there is a need to think of the impossible precisely because it is impossible. Because if you remain within the realm of the possible, then we are in the realm of the past, and it cannot solve this. The unthinkable has happened. So what are you going to do? Are you going to use solutions from the past, right? Are you going to use left wing and right wing, even liberal rights to, you know? I'm not saying we should abandon this, but what more can we think about? What needs to be done? I think that's the question we haven't thought about.
I don't see any more questions, Tony, here.
Yeah,
I just had a little thought, if I may, since we don't have any questions. So since you've extensively studied Buddhist philosophy, I was just wondering, in Buddhism has sort of given importance and significance, supreme importance in the final instance to love, ahimsa, non-violence, you know?
Yes. Did I hear?
And ultimately,
clearly?
Lord Buddha sort of epitomizes the victory of love.
Yes, because one of the key teachings precepts one of the key precepts, one of the first precept in Buddhism in practice is non-violence. It is not to harm other living beings, and to really respect life. It doesn't matter if you can't do it now, but at least hold it as an ideal and try to work towards that. So I think Buddhism has a very powerful impact in Indian thought. Unfortunately, I think in the 13th century, it sort of did not have a stronghold in India. Then it was wiped out by 3 successive warfare. So important thing is that it didn't die out because of a debate and then it lost the debate, but because of warfare, right? Yeah. So I think Badiou has talked about this. How do you reason with violence, right? And then he talked about, of course, being French, he talked about the Greek. I think someone tried to stop the army, and then the guy just used the sword and strike him down. So how do you speak peace to violence? And then this is the perennial question for those advocates of non-violence, right? So I think Buddhism does have this, but unfortunately, it sort of didn't survive as a very strong institution in India. And then it escaped to China. Then again, the successive periods of support by the emperor, and then again persecution, and then it ultimately migrated to Japan. And then again, I think these are periods of territorialization and deterritorialization of Buddhism, as a global religion.
Yeah, particularly Emperor Ashoka, So
Yeah, but wherever it goes, it sort of, there's an ethos of non-violence, and even if you're still violent and unable to change your ways, it makes you reflect on, why am I doing this? Can I stop, or can I kill less, and can I be more kind and compassion? And then it's a religion of some people say it's a religion of humanism, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think, Manoj, we don't have any more questions, and we've had a very, very interesting and thought-provoking session, and a very different way of looking at the whole perspective, and trying to draw in from mythical wars and abstract wars to now fighting a virus. So thank you so much for such an interesting discussion, Dr.
Thank you.
Tony C.
Thank you so much for your hospitality. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And thank you all to all the participants for patiently going through this whole session, and for the questions. Also, Geoff, hello, and thank you for joining. So with that,